Hi everyone. As I said, my name is Martina, and before I get into my presentation, I'd like to quickly introduce myself once again. I've studied information technology at Brno University of Technology, and during my studies, I had been working as a Perl developer for a while, and then moved on to my current position. It kind of works great for me that just the previous presentation was about Agile, as we're going to get even deeper into the topic now. And I would like to introduce you to our current way of working at Kentico, and specifically about the journey that got us where we are now. So let's get into this. I understand that the role of a technical writer and their responsibilities might differ from one tech company to other. And that's why I would like to take a moment here and describe how it works in Kentico. You might be wondering why we decided to use the term content developer rather than a technical writer. And the answer is quite simple, actually. It all goes down to the level of technical skills that we require in order to land the position. Having a technical background is not only helpful, but kind of a must here, because we are, among other things, of course, are also writing code for the tutorials and for the API reference as the code samples. But not only that, being able to think like a developer really makes things easier for you. You're able to communicate with the dev teams, being able to think like your dev personas that you're writing for. And if your product is also something in the tech field, which ours is, it's just easier to get a hold of the general idea behind it. But as you can see from the diagram, that's just one part of the things, like the blue circle, basically. So on top of that, we're also working closely with our UX designers when creating UI copy for the design and basically giving them feedback while doing so. It's also not uncommon to do some research along the lines and basically being on both sides of it. So either being interviewed or doing your own research. And last but not least, we're also working with product managers to properly communicate new features and their benefits to the users. As the time goes by, you also get your own projects, but I'm not gonna go into that because we would be here forever, so let's move on. 3 years ago, when I first started at Kentico, I had been introduced to my then future dev teams. As it usually goes when the company is practicing Scrum, I was integrated into the development team by sitting in the same room with them, attending all their meetings, like daily stand-ups, plannings, retrospectives, and so on. And basically being part of their daily routine. It was all very interesting to see how they communicated with each other, how they dealt with the emerging problems, and it gave me some useful insights into what goes behind the scenes of developing a new feature for our CMS product. And what's more, I heard about some important details that you would otherwise not find out anywhere else, because this was all just part of their face-to-face conversations, and more often than not, it was not happening during any of the regularly scheduled meetings. But this was just the beginning. After a month or so, I acquired another dev team, since the dev team to content developer ratio at the time was something like 2:1. This obviously meant having twice as many meetings, while also having to document twice as many features. Having said that, the information flow was getting bigger. I was switching contexts more often and had to really manage my time wisely. Our collaboration worked quite seamlessly, though. I started giving them early feedback while I was testing the features to get a better understanding of how they work. I reported how my work is progressing during the daily meetings, and They would sometimes also review my work when needed. It seemed like it was all kind of working out for us. Working at a content developer position while being part of a Scrum dev team comes with its challenges. For one, I was integrated, but not fully treated like the other team members. The sense of inequality was just always there. 90% of the meetings I attended consisted of developer-fueled discussions about topics that were mostly irrelevant to documentation. Sure, you'd run across something relevant from now and then, such as like a 30-second mention of a feature that is changing that you wouldn't have realized had you not been there. But the benefit ratio is simply not in our favor. You also can't be everywhere, obviously, especially when you're responsible for multiple teams. This means missing out on some of the impromptu conversations. And as you can probably guess, most of these things were not written down. As a result, you may often see tasks logged without any details because the details were discussed offline. One of the things that started to bother me quite soon enough was that the documentation task didn't have any story points, and so it didn't count toward the overall sprint scope. It was kept separate, and so when the time for reviewing the technical details came, there was no time for it because devs were usually busy finishing the feature itself. And this also brings us to the deadline issue. So having the docs ready at the time of the release and me kind of hoping that all the features I worked on aren't releasing on the same day. Because we collaborated with the dev team so closely, our attention was focused towards creating docs for the upcoming features. That's the way that the tasks were created, and that's also the way our devs thought about it. But then we ended up creating product-centered rather than a user-centered documentation. And the list goes on. I guess we've all been there and know that what working in the Scrum team means to the role of a technical writer or a content developer in our case. After a year or so of me working at the company, a new way of working emerged in one of the development teams. They call themselves Experiment Team, or ET for short. To put it simply, the idea was to get the features to our customers faster, validate them, and improve them based on the feedback we received. So basically, it was the earliest testable product that was released. This all happened because our original product development process, or PDP for short, started to kind of fall short in one way or another. And so the new improved PDP 2.0, as we called it, was introduced. The development team started to adapt to it one by one. At first, it was just like 2 teams, and then the others slowly followed. Part of this change was also dividing the original dev teams into smaller, self-sufficient units of up to only 4 people, as opposed to the original when it was like 8 developers per team, maybe sometimes even 10. This, of course, meant that instead of 2 teams, I suddenly had 4. Yes, it was the same amount of devs, but these teams started to work on their own things and had their own meetings. So my work suddenly doubled. All this also meant a big change for our team of content developers, obviously. Mostly it was because in PDP 2.0, we were no longer part of the core development team. We were, as they called it, specialist roles, which meant that devs needed to specifically ask us for help in case they required some work to be done on our side. And so we had to adapt too. Part of this change was moving out of the dev offices to our dedicated space with the rest of the customer education team. also no longer attending the dev meetings, and basically waiting for the requests to come. As you can probably imagine, change is never easy, and when you basically have to completely rebuild your way of working, it comes as no surprise that there are many challenges ahead of us. It felt like I was missing a lot of context and also some updates that could only be acquired during the daily stand-ups or other Scrum meetings. Or so I thought. Requests coming through Jira simply wouldn't give you the whole picture. I remember how one of my dev teams actually protested too. They wanted to keep things the way they were, having me on their meetings, getting the early feedback, and just other perks that came with the original process. I remember talking to my direct boss about this at the time, actually, and I tried to make him see how, well, this basically made no sense for us. And to better adapt to this new way of working, we agreed to go to daily meetings once a week to at least get some information, especially when it was the week of releasing new features, which is happening every 2 weeks at Kentico. And from time to time, I also attended their retrospectives, where we collectively gave feedback, or, well, better yet, criticism on PDP 2.0 and specifically how my part in all of this changed. But as it usually happens, after some time, we all adapted, and I even stopped attending their meetings after a few weeks. Let me preface this by saying that even before we adapted to this new process, we did create and track our tasks in Jira. We had our own backlog, which was meant for things outside of the usual sprint tasks. So it was for our own projects that we've been working on, maybe some bugs in the docs or even a feedback. The actual tasks for creating docs, however, were part of the dev team's Jira board. So after we've started adjusting for PDP2, this was one of the biggest changes for us. All the requests for documenting something were created in our own backlog, and there was no way around it. Also, we were having regular meetings even before PDP2. These were to talk about any topics we wanted to discuss within the team and to also give an update on what we were currently working on. But we did some changes here too, and I'm going to go into that a bit later. And as I mentioned already, we were all sitting in different offices with our dev teams before, not really communicating with each other outside the meetings we had together, even though we were all working at the same position as a content developer. And after PDP2 was introduced, we moved to the same office space, and within a few weeks, we've all seen some changes happening. So being able to just turn around and ask something right away helped develop better team bonds and also made it easier for new colleagues who still needed a bit more direction during their onboarding. Little by little, we developed into our very own Scrum team. We not only held regular sync meetings as we did before, but we also experimented with daily meetings and added retrospectives. When I say experimented though, it's because we changed the frequency of the daily meetings and the times quite a bit during these last 2 years. How often you need to check in highly depends on the maturity of your team, as senior content developers or technical writers usually know what to work on without the need to sync with the rest of the team so often. But syncing at least once a week seems like a good idea to make sure you're all working towards the sprint goal and that no one's falling behind, basically. And the same goes for the retrospective meetings, which we are currently holding once per 6 weeks. On top of that, we've started planning our own sprints. First, we adapted to the development model where each sprint is 2 weeks long. It made sense at the time since we were still working on a lot of development requests and docs were released at the same time as new product features. But after some trial and error, we resulted in just 1 week sprints, which we're still doing now. This helped us boost our productivity as well as make our planning more flexible, basically. After the initial changes and us getting used to the new way of working, we started coming up with ideas on how to make the process work better for us. The biggest challenge we saw was with the doc requests that kept coming to our backlog and the way we should prioritize them alongside our own tasks from our own projects. At first, we tended to give a higher priority to the requests for documenting new features, simply because that was the way we've used to do it before. We made sure all the new features were documented, and then if there was any time left, we worked on our own projects. And this might come as no surprise, there was usually no time left for our own tasks. So we came up with a system when during the grooming, they would assign values to each task based on its educational impact, user base it would affect, and alignment with the current strategy. We also estimated how long the task would take to complete, so basically its complexity. Based on these numbers, we wouldn't have to worry about our own biases because the automated script would count the values and sort the requests for us. Of course, we needed to tweak the formula behind it a number of times because before we were actually happy with the results. And even now we sometimes pick a different task based on a variety of different factors. But most of the time you can just pick the first task from the backlog and be good to go. When I say we basically reinvented the way we process documentation, it still feels like an understatement, especially when I look at the before, which seems like a long time ago now, even though this all happened in just under 2 years. There are still a lot of things that I didn't mention that went on behind the scenes and a lot of upside downs when we were experimenting with all things Scrum, and we still do, but I'm not going to go into that now. I'd rather tell you what it brought us in the long run, and that I can now honestly say that it was a good idea to do all this. First of all, we are now able to prioritize our work and make the impact where it counts the most. I can see that on the number of projects we did over these 2 years that we wouldn't even dream of finishing while we were just still part of the development teams. And mind you, our team consists of just 3 content developers while we care for over 12 teams in development. So the number of meetings maybe didn't go down because now we have our own ones, but the information you get there is 100% useful to you and not any other role. So we also shifted from the feature-oriented docs. We used to write a lot before. We're now focusing on the main scenarios that the feature covers and describe it while having the right persona in mind. And to add a cherry on the top of this cake, we're slowly teaching our devs to help with some basic documentation and thus reducing our workload on that. And of course, these are not the only benefits, just the most important ones that I wanted to share with you. I understand that some of you might still think that separating technical writers from development doesn't seem like a good idea. But let me tell you this, I was thinking the same thing when we were just first introduced to all this. And I was probably the most stubborn about it too. It was partly because I really liked working with my teams from the development, and so losing all those friendships wasn't appealing to me at all. But of course, that's not what happened here. And what I'm trying to say is, if I could do it, you can certainly too. This was documenting in Scrum. Is there a better way? And thank you for attention.
Oh, thank you, Martina. And I have the first two questions, actually, if I can, if I
Sure.
may. So, what you did with your current docs, I mean with the feature-oriented docs, did you change it? Did you rewrote something? So, or you just started with a new scenario documentation, included just new features, but the old docs stayed untouched?
We kind of did this thing where each time we kind of needed to adjust an existing documentation, we were also changing it to the way that it would be scenario oriented. So that basically it wasn't like all at one time. We did it during, I don't know, maybe a half a year. It took us to redo the existing documentation to our current state, but it was definitely worth it. And we hear so many compliments to like what was it before and what it is now, and how we basically completely redid the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Great. And second, how you persuaded all writers to change approach, and does it mean you need to know product better, or who will tell you the overall scenarios? It's not you, right? You need to contact customers. How you developed it?
So it's kind of like two questions in one.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
I'll start with the first part. As I said, we are a very small team. So currently it's just three of us actually,
Mm.
and even though it's a very small team, we're kind of being able to do all this because we just went with it. Our boss is really good at persuading us, and it wasn't my job to persuade anyone because I'm just part of the team. I'm not the boss right here. And it was a long process because the teams in development started on this PDP 2.0 not all at once. It was just one team, then other team, and so we kind of learned while one team went on the new way of working, then the other for the other developer, and it was incremental basically. It was not all at once. So we have like half a year to adjust to this. So it wasn't like a big boom or something because that would be a disaster. And I don't remember the second part of the question. Sorry.
I wanted to know uh, who gave you these scenarios?
Right.
Because you don't have contact with customers, right? Or
Yeah.
do you?
No, we don't. Just through tickets of customer support and such, but not a direct. So the thing is, we kind of introduced this new way of creating a request in Jira. And this was done through a template that we kind of made everyone use. And it has to contain all the important information. There is a context, there is a motivation, there needs to be anything, the exact goal that you kind of want us to achieve. And through this, we kind of got into all the important information because developer really needs to think about what he wants us to do before he actually creates the ticket. And so we've got usually like 90% of information is currently in that one request. And if it's not, we can always ask the developer or the product manager at hand that's kind of overseeing this new feature.